Welcome back to A People's Guide to Publishing. I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing and Distribution. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 25 years.
I'm Ellie Blue. I'm the editorial and marketing director here at Microcosm. We are an independent mid-list publisher based in Portland, Oregon, and Cleveland, Ohio. We have over 700 books, over 25 employees, and we make about 40 new books every year. And we distribute thousands of titles from other publishers.
We started this podcast so that we can share what we've learned with newer publishers so that you can learn from our mistakes.
Or maybe you just want to understand the publishing industry.
This week we have special guest to the pod, Danny Caine, back for a reprise appearance and a new book. Believe that or not. How to Protect Bookstores, which I will remind present company, we proposed doing that book literally that day of the previous podcast recording. So can you talk a little bit about how we hornswoggled you into this, Danny?
Yeah, I think you and I both had the idea to write a book about bookstores. I kind of had the idea in my head of telling a similar story about the importance of community and bookstores and small businesses, but telling it from a more, I don't want to say positive perspective because it's not necessarily a cheerful book, but from a perspective that shows the possibilities as opposed to the worst of the worst, which the Amazon book does. And so I wanted to tell stories about bookstores that highlighted the potential and what bookstores could do. And in chatting after we recorded that podcast over the delicious food at Cafe Avalon in Cleveland, you seem to have a similar idea. So we were basically on the same page from the get-go, and I just fired off a 1 or 2 page proposal and sent it to you, and you liked it, and then I was off on a really fun year or two of research and writing for this book. I was a little sad to turn this one
in. Yeah, you seem to have a lot of fun with this one.
Yeah, I mean, it was to go, of course, like going to other cities and visiting bookstores is basically what my vacations look like. So in a little bit, research felt like vacation, but it was also really inspiring to get to talk to folks on a deep level about what they believe in and the possibilities of bookstores and what inspires them and what challenges them. And they were really meaningful conversations. Some of folks I already consider friends, and some folks I consider new friends after finishing the research in the book.
So what was the research process like? Did you just kind of drop into bookstores around the world and say, hey, can we talk?
Oh, no, I wanted to give them far enough advance. And I've done enough interviews to understand that people really appreciate being able to schedule this and not having it sprung upon them. Yeah, so for each store, I would email and set up a time and do some research on my own and read their website and whatever's been published about them. In some cases, folks have already written really eloquently about their experiences. And so I would kind of gather that all up and try to get as much of a sense of the background of the store as I could, because you don't want, if you have an hour or two of someone's time, you don't want to make them do exposition. Like, you want to get to the good stuff right away. And I understand the demands of being a bookstore owner, and people don't have time to sit down for 6-8 hour interviews. And being a bookstore owner myself, I don't have time to sift through those transcripts if I'm trying to write this book while maintaining an active career as a bookseller. So I would research and gobble up everything I could about the stores, and then I would get to the store, and each visit involved an in-depth conversation with at least one of the booksellers, often more than one. As well as just time trying to experience the store as a customer. I wanted to give a sense of the flavor of each space. One of the things that really struck me about these 11 or 12 stores is they all felt so different on the inside, and there's so many different ways to do it. Some are dusty and very old feeling, and others are sleek and new. Others are neighborhoody, and still others are really cosmopolitan feeling. And I wanted to give readers, I mean, even that alone is a sense of how many different ways there are to do this bookstore thing. So yeah, it ended up being, a full day of work at each store, getting to know the folks and the customers in the store itself. So yeah, I did that times 11 or 12. And there were even interviews that I just did for background and context that didn't make it into the book. So I ended up visiting more stores than actually ended up getting written about.
So you did have fun.
How did you
Yes.
choose the source that you wrote about?
And it's I there were a couple factors going into it. I wanted a good mix. I knew there had to be an employee-owned cooperative in there, which is how I got to Red Emma's, and I heard really good things about them reputationally, which from my conversation with them, they live up to 100%. I knew I wanted to really tell the story of Black-owned bookselling in the United States, and that meant more than one Black-owned bookstore, because a lot of things that get written about, one feeling, there's a lot of pressure on the folks who run Black-owned bookstores that they end up serving as tokens, and I definitely didn't want to do that at all. So there are 3 Black-owned bookstores in the book. One of which, Source Booksellers, is the oldest Black-owned bookstore in the Midwest, and then a couple newer ones that are dealing with the issues of bookselling and Black-owned bookselling in particular. And I knew I wanted an indigenous bookstore, which is how I ended up at Birch Bark in Minneapolis. And then beyond that, I wanted to tell a broad story of what it means to be a bookstore. And I had an idea of the stories I kind of wanted to tell. Like, I knew I wanted to talk about how hard it was to gather financing to open a new bookstore. And I knew my friend Janet from Avid Bookshop in Athens, Georgia, had gone through a lot of that when she was starting. And so I talked to her about that and ended up being able to tell that story in what I think is a fairly compelling way. And so it was a combination of the stories I wanted to tell and the breadth I wanted for the book. And then it was, there was a real economic reality of just where I could get to and where I could afford. So a lot of them were in the Midwest, where I could just like throw a suitcase in the trunk of the car and drive. A couple were cheap flights. And then I did get lucky enough to get to Paris to write about Shakespeare and Company, but that was because I got flown out to present at a bookselling conference in Prague and bought myself a cheap plane ticket from Prague to Paris. So, I really love publishing with Microcosm, and you guys have done a great job with both of these books, and I'm honored to be on the team. But it's like the way these contracts aren't set up aren't such that, I can get a 6-figure advance and do all this research, which is fine. That's just part of the game. But I think I was able, with my Midwestern bookseller salary, to cobble together some pretty good research trips and tell a complete story regardless.
And I liked how you put that in the book too, that you were like, full disclosure, like the publisher is not paying for me to go to all these places. I actually just have this much fun, but it's out of pocket.
Right. Well, and it's, I like people, I had heard some good feedback that I was transparent about my own salary and how to resist Amazon and why. And there's no reason to hide that stuff, especially if the book is already dealing with the economic realities of being a bookseller.
Right. And that's something like we really dabble in too. I've found similarly that people will very freely try to loan you money when you don't need to borrow money. And when you desperately need to borrow money, nobody will loan it to you because you're a bad risk. And, on that front, it's like we've been transparent in, well, just about everything. Like we publish our finances annually and, we give all the profits to the employees and, like we have you could look up what we did last year and the year before and the year before that. And, and I feel like that is sort of like how you beget trust, but similar to what you're doing, it's also like how you model mistakes and corrections and like what you've learned from, decades of doing this. So the thing that I appreciated most about like the final book, is that it's like, I hear it every single day of my life where people are like, oh, nobody reads anymore. There's no more bookstores. It's all shot and over. And I know, because I like follow the news and read the statistics and like, there's that awesome reporting from NPR about bookstores from 2007 to 2019, I believe it was, and like how much they grew and like how much sales had gone up. And, like that's a narrow window. But as a Midwesterner, I really appreciated that you like focused on that. And I really appreciated the way that you sort of told it as like if you do it right, it's not actually a bad gig. You just have to make, you just can't be too idealistic in how you approach it financially. So why was that the story that you wanted to tell?
Well, I spent a lot of time. It's been really interesting to tour behind How to Resist Amazon and Why. That tour has gone on for 3 years now. I just did an event in Roanoke about the book. And talking about that has been really interesting and seeing what people respond to. And so really often, the successful events are not just doom and gloom about Amazon. You need to give people something to hang on to and fight for. And there is good news in the bookstore world. Almost 100 bookstores owned by people of color have opened in the United States in the last 3 years, and that's amazing news. And each one of those people have been creative and tenacious enough to get around some really serious obstacles to even opening their bookstore. At the same time, it's really hard to keep a bookstore open. And I think with this new generation of bookstores that opened during the pandemic, a lot of them are now seeing the difficult realities as inflation ramps up and the kind of crazy consumer spending of 2021 and 22 is slowing down. It gets to be a tough spot of like, okay, how do we make this sustainable? There was a ton of goodwill when we opened. How do we keep this going into something that's going to anchor its community for a long time? So it's both like you want to cheer people up and tell them they're doing a good job by allowing these bookstores to stay open, but there is an obligation. It's a community operation, a good bookstore, and community is about exchange. What can the community do for the bookstore, and what can the bookstore do for the community? And so in attempting to celebrate the good news, but also illustrate the challenges that are still there, I want to make people understand the real good that can come from a bookstore, but also the obligation to keep it going to enable that good to keep happening.
Bookstores are one of the few businesses that I can think of. This happened with a community grocery store in my hometown when I lived there, but like other than that, yeah, I've only ever really seen this about bookstores where like if a bookstore is in financial trouble, often the neighbors will financially bail it out. And that's, I don't know, I guess that does, yeah, speak very well of the importance in the community. My question for you though is like, in publishing, a lot of times we see our fellow publishers, and I'm this way myself, like we get into this business because we love books, not because we're like business minded or know the first thing about what we're doing in business. And I do suspect it's the same way for a lot of new booksellers. Like they love the books, their heart's in the right place, totally passionate, and then they have to get a loan or make a budget or run payroll, and they're like, what the heck? And yeah, I was wondering like what what have you noticed about like what makes the difference between sort of a financially successful and unsuccessful bookstore? Like, is it the community bailing it out, or is it like more about sort of a stable business sense?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think like so often the answer to any question about bookstores in general is that, like it's different for every bookstore, which is part of the fun and part of the challenge. I'm thinking of two particular examples from the book that can help me talk about this. One of which is both bookstores I've mentioned already, but the first is Avid Bookshop. And I think about Janet, who's the owner there, told me this anecdote about going to the University of Georgia to speak to their business school. And one of the issues I talk about in that chapter is finding the right size for your business. And Janet was at 2 bookstores, and then they shrunk to 1 bookstore on purpose, and it's just a way of right sizing their business. And if you listen to business schools, or what you would call a good business sense, Ellie, the idea is expand at all costs. And it's like which is, I understand the context here.
It's bad advice.
Talking to the people who are in the midst of combining 2 warehouses. But it's not like the answer isn't always expanding. I'm sure it's right for you guys, and you see the demand, and you can think about ways to do it sustainably. But at these business school talks, she had students come up to her and be like, I just want to open a hair salon in my hometown. And every class here is talking to me about IPOs. And so, like, in a way, running a bookstore doesn't necessarily follow the laws of capitalism. Because I don't think it is about making anybody rich, and it's not about expanding or franchising in every case. but it's more about creating a sustainable business that serves its community. And you've got to ask some questions that aren't necessarily purely capitalist questions to do that. At the same time, that doesn't mean you should do things sloppily. And I think about talking to Red Emmas, who they resist a little bit the idea that an anarchist or a leftist bookstore, an employee-owned co-op, has to be kind of a ragged operation. They're very proud of their systems. They're very serious about developing sustainability, and they want to develop a system that they can export to other businesses so they can become employee-owned co-ops. So they're really serious about making money, which is funny for kind of a bunch of anarchists and socialists. But they're funny because they want to change the world in a way that there are more democratic environments where people can function and thrive.
Yeah, that's great. And I mean, there used to be like 100 anarchist bookstores like that in the United States. And then like as urban rents went up over the last 30 years, it's just like one by one, it was just like unbelievable to watch. And and now it's really, well, and this is kind of what I say about bookstores too, is it's like the ones that are well managed and smart are the ones that like, had foresight to buy their building, or were ahead of the curve on like systems management. And the thing that I really think about is the like, and I have a friend that he's an author, but he really likes to talk mostly about business. And so he's always like, I don't believe in the grow at all costs. I believe more in the like, you have to have new challenges and like learn new things and be excited by like what's going on around you. And I take it more in the like, you want to sort of follow the trajectory of like what's already happening, So like when we added the warehouse, the people at Penguin Random House were like, wow, that's really brazen and brave. And, like you're going to do that now. And we're like, well, it's not that we're like taking a risk. It's that we're like responding to what's happening around us, and that like we waited too long, if anything, to do this. And, and so like, does that sort of wean into book selling? Like, I feel like part of the trouble, the other end of it is like the problem of being cool is that you will not permanently be cool. It's sort of the nature of, and I feel like as a bookstore, you're often like the cool bookstore, but then that means you can't be the cool bookstore in 5 years.
Well, I am not motivated by being cool. I have never considered myself cool. And it's like throughout all of the attention the Raven has gotten over the last couple of years, we have remained focused on Lawrence, Kansas. And a lot of our advocacy and work is, it touches into Amazon and national issues, but we still do a lot of work with what Lawrence, Kansas needs. And that's, the real measure of a sustainability of a bookstore is how strong the bonds are to its community. And maybe you can't be cool for 35 years, but you can be really valuable to your community for a long time. And you look at the bookstores that have real longevity, like think about Paris without Shakespeare and Company, or think about San Francisco without City Lights, or think about Detroit without Source Booksellers. And these places have found ways to become so ingrained and so valuable to their communities that it's just impossible to think about those communities without them. And so that will outlast any fad. If the bookstore is flexible enough and creative enough to adapt to the changes in their communities and remain essential to the people that they serve, that's the secret to success. And again, that's not what they're going to teach you in an MBA.
Right. And to be clear, I didn't mean that the Raven won't be cool forever. The Raven will be cool forever. But I mean more that like as an economic driver, a bookstore is often like really buoyed by like, it's just, it's an exciting thing that's happening, especially when it's new, and that you can't run on that energy forever. Right. You have to, like, as you said, maintain relevance for your community because they are ultimately the people that, you like support each other, as you said.
Right. And it's the reason I put Source Booksellers at the end of the book is because Janet, who's one of the owners, half of the mother-daughter team who runs that store, I was asking her about the relationship between bookstores and community, and she basically said bookstores are community. There's no relationship because they're one and the same. And that felt as good of a place as any to kind of conclude the book.
I love that. I mean, so when we first talked about the book, which was when we were recording episode 151, go back and watch it, about how to resist Amazon. I remember I threw out a title idea. I think it was like how to support bookstores, how to support independent bookstores. And you were like, well, that's easy. Universal health care. Your immediate response.
Has that happened yet?
Sadly, no. But it did make me, I mean, I do feel like that is like, the like community support and coming and like shopping at a bookstore, or even helping a bookstore in a time of crisis is one thing, but like it does seem like if we want to have nice things like bookstores that really are so central to our communities, we do need to do some different things on a more on a bigger picture level.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about like, especially as a independent bookstore, as someone who runs one, like what are the societal things that are like kind of almost holding you back from being able to serve that function?
Sure. Well, it's interesting that the verb in the title, I think, was the biggest point of contention in coming up with this book, because Ellie wanted support, Joe wanted save, and neither of them felt right to me.
I wanted the religious undertones,
I'm glad we ended with Protect, especially because over the course of writing the book, bookselling has become a more dangerous job, which we can talk about later if you want, but that's not the question at hand. It's like anything. I talk in the book about how like a bookseller can be worried about antitrust policy and the reason that the backdoor lock is sticking at the same time. It's like a collision of large scale and small scale concerns, and that's just one of the unique hallmarks of being an activist and being a business owner who makes politics part of what they do. So I think that it like everything else, it comes back to Amazon and what they've done to the market, and it's really the book market and a lot of the online retail market in general is just broken, and that's a hard thing for an individual to fight for. But there are things you can do, and one of the things I talk about in the book is how it's like a lot of this stuff happens municipally, and it's like I end a couple chapters on the note that's just like, go to your city council meeting and show up and be a loud voice. And there are so many stories in the book of places where that's worked or where that's important. And it's like, okay, you can't get Joe Manchin to change his mind. Nobody can do that. But like, you can show up to city council and get your 3 minutes of public comment. And that might, impact how many tax credits the Amazon warehouse gets or what the minimum wage law in your community is. So there are ways to shape policy that aren't federal, and that's important. But at the same time, I mean, like, policy is a good way to protect bookstores. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to go to France, is because they've got it figured out in many ways that the United States doesn't. And the striking thing to me, the fact I keep getting hung up on, is that Paris, which is a city of 2.5 million people, has 1,000 bookstores. And that's, if you compare a US city of that size, that's Chicago, who has 55 bookstores. And the main reason why Paris and France in general can have such thriving bookstores is because Paris and their government have decided that bookstores are a cultural asset in France. And just like cheese and just like wine, they have policy to protect that cultural asset. And the main policy they have is called the Lang Law, which says that nobody, regardless of size or scope, can discount a book more than 5%. And that alone, it was passed in 1981. In the last 40 years, that alone has created this thriving and really diverse bookstore scene. And so, like, policy can work, and really simple policy, and it's worth fighting for, but I know it can get frustrating. And so that's why there's always the option of showing up at City Hall too.
Right. I love that. And and it's like such a simple, basic law that would have like completely circumvented Amazon, that would have completely like prevented any kind of market dominance like we saw in the United States. That's fascinating. I did not know that France had this, but that makes perfect sense. I mean, I remember when Amazon tried to close their warehousing in France, when there was a strike, and the French government was like, "Oh no, you actually cannot do that."
Yeah,
And I
right.
was like, ooh.
I
This
mean,
is
the other thing about Paris is in France is, boy, do they know how to strike. And the labor union movement is so much more active and vibrant there. And it's like one of the people I talked to about the Lang Law represented a bookstore association, which is actually legally defined as a union. So like, imagine if the ABA was a union, and like that's how the bookstores are organized in France. Even the owners are unionized together. And so that's just like organized labor, pro small business policy can really make a big difference in the vibrancy of bookstores. And I like communities too. Like, you just walk around in Paris, it's like there's so much vibrant life on the sidewalk. It's not perfect. It's like, of course it's not paradise, but in terms of bookstores and small businesses, I think they really have some things figured out.
Right. And that's, I mean, and the US is shifting back in that direction culturally. Like, we've had the rise of unions, we've had the rise of like labor stand downs and bordering on strikes this couple past years, which is like a major shift. I mean, that's not been that way. Like, we've kind of strayed from that culture for some time. But it's like, we're not to the degree of like federal protections or things like that. And the statistic that I struck upon, which I don't remember, though correct me if I'm wrong, being in either book, is that Amazon is 25 times actually more than 25 times the size of all big five publishers combined, or more than 10 times the size of the entire publishing industry. Which, like, that was kind of the point where I was like, and I only stumbled into this because somebody was trolling me on Reddit and like really wanted to go on about how it wasn't Amazon that was the problem, it was the big five. And I was like, well, this is all public information, we can get to the bottom of this. But that like really struck me, because I was like, right, so it's like 10 times the size of books. Like, we're now more than an afterthought. But so like, I guess that's, and you the other books, the questions we got most frequently when we were just talking about your book to booksellers into the industry is they were like, well, how is it different from, that book that came out last year from Yale, or like, these other ones? And they're like, well, those ones all like wax philosophical about bookstores, whereas like there will be actual information and how to, and this will be a lot more pragmatic of a book, and so was that I mean, I'm guessing that was an intentional choice, or like maybe just fundamentally who you are?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. And it is important for me. I think there's a tendency in a lot of kind of A-list nonfiction to just towards, I guess, objectivity, and having a remove, and like being afraid, or like being non-willing, or not able to call something evil. Like these big hardback nonfiction books about Amazon aren't gonna outright say Amazon is bad. And like, of course, like, no, that's not a story the big five wants to tell, because they rely on Amazon for so much. And I understand why they're not happy about relying on Amazon so much, but still half of their business or more is coming from Amazon. But I mean, it's different audiences. Like, the thing about this fight, and just the thing about my politics in general, is that there's got to be a lot of different ways to fight. And I have chosen to write books with a lot of focus on action and individual steps for a broad audience, that are easy to read, and I say accessible. And that's important. And my goal is to broaden the conversation and to have tools where booksellers can use in having these discussions with their customers. At the same time, I think it is really important for people to have a serious philosophical tome on the importance of literature and bookstore. And it's like, I'm really excited about Josh Cook's book, The Art of Libromancy, which is out from Biblioasis. We're doing events together. And they're both about the importance of bookstores and booksellers, but he, I think, takes a much more serious and philosophical approach to it. And he's looking at, the book is an essay collection about the philosophy and the art of bookselling, whereas I've got these political steps to protect their ability to do that. And both of them are important books. It's a big fight. We need a lot of people in it. Yeah.
So speaking of protecting booksellers' ability to sell books, what has been your experience of book bans?
We've been pretty lucky in Lawrence. We have a really supportive community. I've been talking to our librarians, and we haven't heard much in town, but like less than an hour away in St. Mary's, Kansas, there was a really serious effort to basically shut down their public library, and it was the library leases the space from the city. And the city commission decided to put a morality clause in their lease renewal that said they wouldn't have any divisive material
At a library.
Right.
Wow.
Including, and they mentioned they had their dog whistles in there of I forgot what the phrases were, but they definitely mentioned critical race theory, but it was just total dog whistles. And the librarian refused to sign it. And then the city was like, okay, we aren't going to renew your lease. And then there was tremendous public outcry, including just really a couple of city commission meetings that were just packed with library supporters. And they eventually got the city commission to back down and just offer a clean lease renewal for 1 year. I'm sure they're going to try it again, but still what solved it was public outcry and people showing up to the meetings. And the really scary part is the first people that were reporting on this were the Kansas Reflector, which is a tiny nonprofit newspaper that was started by people who worked at the Topeka Capital Journal, but then were left without a journalistic home when that newspaper was bought out. I think Gannett, one of the monopoly gobblers of newspapers. And so they started this tiny nonprofit newspaper. And like without that article and without that reporter working on the story, I'm not sure anyone would have heard about it. And that would have been a really different story. And so that's why I end up writing about libraries and newspapers and bookstores, because it's kind of the holy trinity of community. They all work together, and they were all really important signs of the health of a community. And it's kind of scary to think about a community without them.
Yeah. Wow. That is shocking. Like every inch of that is shocking. That I started out being like, can you repeat the name of that book, which I since found, and we're gonna stock it because of you. So good work. And then by the end, I was just like, my jaw is on the floor.
I know.
How
my wonderful editor, Olivia, had to kind of dial me back on the St. Mary's story a little bit. I really, really wanted to go in depth. And I think someone needs to write a book about this town because there's all sorts of crazy other stuff. But Olivia, bless her heart, was like, this is a good story. It's really interesting. Parts of it are relevant to your book, and let's stick to those parts.
Olivia. she's a diplomat. She's gonna run the UN in a few years. We have things all the time where she, the way she'll talk to me about something is very different than the way she'll talk to like the person who is much more emotionally invested in it. And I'm like, she is good.
Yeah. She did a great job.
Mm-hmm. So but that, and we had this an hour away in Boring, Oregon, it was a similar kind of thing. And this was 25 years ago where they shut down the public library because they were like, I just don't want to pay for it. Mm-hmm. Whereas nowadays everything it's like a posturing political fight way more than it's like a fiscal conservancy fight, And so are you seeing that aspect running into book selling, or is that, I've heard stories where there was somebody in the UP that was like, it's scary because sometimes you'll be alone in the store and some dude will come in and he'll shout at you, do you even have this book, or do you sell critical race theory? And you have to diffuse the situation.
Yeah. De-escalation is increasingly a super important skill for booksellers, and it's like none of us want to be in the middle of a culture war, but here we are. And I think the tide is turning a little bit in fortunate ways. And I really think the right, as it's operating in the country right now, is completely empty of any actual ideas. They are operating in opposition to things that they are scared of or things they think are icky, or I don't even know. It's hard for me to wrap my head around it, but they just try to fire up the base by being in opposite. They pick easy targets to punch down on, and it's like, okay, trans people and books about them. This will get people angry. So we're going to focus on this. And I think the courts are beginning to show it. And I think it's really important to like actually these crazy laws that are getting passed to try to hold them up to legal scrutiny, because they'll fall apart. Hopefully, fingers crossed. And so I like the ABA has sued in Arkansas and Texas on their super restrictive book bans. I am excited to see how those go, and I would hope that this Texas law kind of falls apart under legal scrutiny. If the First Amendment means anything, the Texas law won't be allowed to stand. And so, but at the same time, I mean, it's that split between like really big concerns and really small concerns, and you'd be like, okay, Texas, this law has really bad recriminations against the First Amendment, but here's this guy who's asking us to order Mein Kampf or whatever, and you have to be able to deal with both. And so a lot of it is just that, is de-escalation. It's a tricky discussion, and I think a lot of bookstores handle it really differently. Like in theory, you want to be a home for everybody, and where's the line between like welcoming this person and this person impacting everybody else's ability to find a home here? And that's why book selling is a human art. Because I mean, we've got people on the team who are really, really good at that, and they're really important to have on the team because they can diffuse those situations. They can make people feel heard, but still let them know that certain behaviors and actions aren't welcome in a place like this. And like, again, that's really complicated and nuanced, and that's why book selling is a human. It has to be done by humans, and compassionate humans at that.
I love that. I just want to ask one more question, because I know you have to save your voice to record the How to Support audiobook. We're all excited to hear it. If the end is a little scratchy, you'll know it's our fault.
Okay, no worries.
But I was reflecting back on when we first started to work with you, when you had published the How to Resist Amazon and Why zine, which you initially self-published, and we started working with you to publish it. And then I saw your name start popping up everywhere, and it was always in conjunction with some like great pandemic related idea. Like you were doing bicycle deliveries of books, and you were doing like an initiative where people could kind of like pay to buy books for somebody who couldn't afford books, and people could write in. And I just feel like with a marketing mind like yours, like I would like to put you in charge of responding to the current issues facing book selling, especially the book bans. What are do you have like creative ideas for what could be done? Maybe something somebody could pick up and run with in order to kind of like put an end to these culture wars.
That's a good question. I wish it would be $1 million idea.
Yeah, no pressure.
Yeah, I think
just like put it out on our podcast now.
It's right. The idea is like I keep coming back to the idea that if you do something well and you make enough connections in your community, you just keep doing what you're doing. And so it's easy to worry about the national book bans, and I think we have to. And I think that's like, I'm on the ABA board. We've been really encouraging publishers and the ABA to fight back against this. And like when publishers ask us for feedback, 9 times out of 10, what we tell them is, you are not doing enough for your authors, and you need to fight for these books and these readers. And I think we're seeing some more effort from publishers too. Another thing that I get hung up on is a little bit like, one of my personal policies, it sounds like maybe Joe doesn't have this policy, but like, I don't get into bad faith arguments online. It's not worth it to me and my personal stamina. And a lot of this is just a big bad faith argument. And like, if you keep serving your community, like, you're not going to win against a far right troll. They will find ways of just defeating you in public. And so like, there's a little bit that's like, we're going to focus on our community and what they need, and not this person who has never been to our store and knows nothing about us. And so I think like the one of the most inspiring stories from my own store, and I feel like I can talk about this because it wasn't my idea. It was organized by some of our other owners, and so I can give them all the flowers they deserve without kind of congratulating myself. Is we just had a queer mixer where we closed an hour early and sent out invitations and said like the store is a space for queer people for these 2 hours on a Thursday night. We're going to order some books that they might be interested in. Some organizations are going to table. We're going to have resources for people to file, legal name changes before Kansas passes their crazy anti-trans law. And it was a huge, joyful night. It was really wonderful. The store was packed, and we got a ton of thank yous, and the photos from it were really lovely. And like that's it to me. And we did the same thing for librarians and teachers, actually. So we had these 2 mixer nights, and it's like, we know it's hard right now for you folks. We've got a space. We can open it just for you. We can try to do some stuff that's tailored directly to you, and you can just come and be yourselves and be here and be safe from the trolls for at least 2 hours. And like, that's what you do. And like, it's so local and it's so community driven, but that's what, that's what bookstores can do. And I would much rather host a queer mixer or a celebration night for librarians than try to get into a fight with all the trolls who want to ban all of these YA books. It's like, let's let the judges take care of that, and let's just support our community in what they need.
Well, to your point, I have a happy ending to that story. So, and Ellie will swear up and down that I taught her this, and I will swear up and down that she taught me this. So, which is kind of like how most things go at Microcosm, is most people don't take like credit for the best ideas. But what I do is I will like put a objective citation in front of somebody that like politely refutes the presumption they've made that's wrong, and that was what I did. And I did have to do it, maybe in your defense, 10 or 11 times. But Reddit, not exactly a bastion of positive discourse on the internet, deleted this person's account.
Okay.
So who the hell knows, like,
Right.
what he said in response the 12th time,
Okay. Well, like I said, it's a fight that requires lots of different skills. And Joe, I'm glad you're there taking on the trolls.
But my point is that, and like, I think of this on a different level, where like, I'm thinking about this for everybody that's watching me not cave to these bad faith arguments, and like watching me be like, here is another AAP report about like what is actually happening in the world of publishing. And, because that's the audience I'm always concerned about. It's not like some asshole that's like, oh, you don't even know, LOL. And so, but the note I want to end on is that I saw a tweet this morning, which was like, the publishing that I'm invested in comes from a place of empathy. This is very badly paraphrased, or maybe very well paraphrased, who can really say. And when I see publishing that's not coming from a place of empathy, like that's when I disinvest. And I think like that's why your books resonate so much, is that like you're so concerned about like the reader, the people you're writing about, the like all of the various stakeholders that are composed to the art of what you're doing. And to that question, I would say, like, what are you going to do next?
That's a good question. I after spending what amounts to 5 or 6 beautiful years of nonfiction with Microcosm, I am knee deep in a poetry book right now. So I think the tentative title is Jewish American Dream. It's reckoning with a lot of the questions of being in an interfaith marriage, of raising a child, of just being a contemporary American Jew. And it's been really, really rewarding to just like sink into poetry. I mean, I've loved writing these books, but I've missed my buddy poetry for a while here. So that's where I'm at. But if I come up with another good, empathetic, action-based nonfiction proposal, you guys are going to be the first to hear about it.
Poetry can be empathetic too, and if you need more positive encouragement, my best friend is a poet, and she was like, Danny is like a good poet. and she doesn't offer that one lightly.
Okay,
So
cool.
there you go.
I'm glad to hear it.
All right,
And
well, everybody read Danny's poetry after you're done with
and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you both for everything. This is a fun conversation.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
On Twitter at Microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at Microcosm_pub.
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.